Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to Freeforum, a world that just might work. I'm going to be speaking today with Dave PELL, writer of the popular and well-respected daily newsletter, The Next Draft, who's recently released his first book, Please Scream Inside Your Heart, Breaking News and Nervous Breakdowns in the Year That Wouldn't End. You can learn more at nextdraft.com or pleasescream.com. One for the newsletter, one for the book. On Freeforum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, and more, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show airs as specials on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com. Podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Podomatic.com, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY, terrencemcnally.net. When I look at where I need to steal or open up or repurpose some time so that I can finally make headway on some important projects I've been putting off, my prime suspect is the time I spend reading, digesting, collecting, and sharing online. I'm not addicted to Facebook or Twitter or any other specific rabbit hole/platform, but more to the 5 digital newspapers and numerous other news and issue sites whose digests show up every day in my inbox vying for my attention. And one of those is The Next Draft by today's guest, Dave PELL. What I find admirable, useful, and infuriating is the fact that Dave has taken my time-swallowing temptation and made it his job, and at least for now, his life's work. Each day he pores over 75 news sites, chooses the 10 most fascinating stories, and gives you his take on current events, very broadly imagined. A lot of politics, sure, but business, finance, culture, climate, health, science, sports, just about anything in the news, again, broadly defined, that Dave chooses to share. But he doesn't just share the links. He introduces and contextualizes each and every article, each event. Now, I assume a lot of people do this. I imagine that's how things like Breitbart and Daily Kos were born. But I make a point to read Dave PELL's Next Draft just about every day, and I have since 2017, when a friend first assumed I did and then assured me I must. I've unsubscribed from a lot of feeds over the years, and I'm always looking for new ones to eliminate, but Next Draft is safe. And now Dave has written a book, Please Scream Inside Your Heart. It's a pretty much chronological ride through 2020, a year that included 2 impeachment trials, a global pandemic, Black Lives Matter, the largest protest in our nation's history, Trump versus Biden, the largest election, at least by vote count, in our nation's history. It also included a slide towards autocracy, and, of course, a warning from the makers of Lysol not to drink their products. Built around snippets of information, analysis, and entertainment first offered in the newsletter, the book is held together with the hindsight and the reflection possible as Dave looks back at what we've all been through, and with a good dose of perspective he's taken from the experience of his parents, both survivors of the Holocaust. Known to his readers as the Internet's managing editor, Dave PELL has been writing about news, technology, and media since 1999. A graduate of UC Berkeley and Harvard School of Education, he sits on the board of 826 Valencia and is a longtime advisor to the Center for Investigative Reporting. He's also created a couple of startups along the way and is the managing partner at Arba Seed Investment Group, angel investing in companies like OpenTable and Grubhub. And Please Scream Inside Your Heart is his first book. Welcome, Dave PELL, to Freeforum, a world that just might work.
Thanks a lot for having me. Great to be here.
Very good. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Tuesday, the 1st of March. Now, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and ideas that we talk about. So I've laid a little bit about there, but can you tell us a bit about your path to what we're talking about today, to the newsletter, to the book. And feel free to go way back. Childhood incidents, mentors, turning points, moments of decision, any of that.
Sure. I mean, we'll go back to my childhood briefly, where I was sort of a trained to be a media Jedi and a news addict way before the internet, sort of in the earliest days of CNN and cable news. As you mentioned in the intro, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors, and so news played a unusually large role in our lives for two reasons. One, because they knew how much world news could impact somebody's individual life because they had been through that and seen that with their own eyes. And secondly, because we probably wanted to avoid some more interpersonal and more painful topics. So it's always nice to have an external topic to discuss. And the one we bonded on, there were really two. Wheel of Fortune was huge in my house, and then the rest of it was pretty much all news. So I spent a lot of time talking about anti-Semitism and world news and those type of topics as I was a kid. And so when the internet came, it sort of took that addiction that I'd already developed or interest and turned it into an addiction. And luckily, the internet tools that emerged over time from blogging to newsletters to apps sort of allowed me to take that somewhat probably negative addiction that I had and turn it into a product. And that's how Next Draft sort of emerged. It started as a newsletter where I would just cover tech news, actually, in the early days of the internet. Being in the Bay Area and sort of having a front row seat to the internet revolution part one was sort of so interesting and exciting, and there were so many amazing stories. So I used to just send out a newsletter on that topic. But
Again,
then
again, daily.
yeah, that was daily. It was really similar to Next Draft. It was the
Mm-hmm.
10 most interesting tech stories of the
Yep.
day. It started just going out to a group of CEOs and entrepreneurs that I worked with, so they didn't have to waste their time
Sure.
doing that. But my passion has always been writing, so every time I have a chance to work writing into whatever I'm doing, that's what I do. And so when the first internet bust came, I was sort of writing a daily obituary column, so I decided that would be a good time to sort of widen the scope of the newsletter to more accurately match my interests, which was really all news. And that's how Next Draft was born, and it sort of grew from there.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I've read that you were doing something akin to this even before the internet, where you would just personally send things to people, your take on stuff.
Yeah, the early internet was definitely built with my bizarre habits in mind. But yeah, I used to write like a 30 to 35 page sort of update, sort of like if you are irritated by those long Christmas cards you
Yeah,
get from
yeah.
people that tell you all the details they get in their life. Imagine that, but 30 pages with jokes. And I would print it and bind it at my local copy store and then send it out to about 30 or 40 people. So no one was more relieved that Mark Andreessen developed a web browser than those 30 or 40 people who were no longer they could now at least hit an unsubscribe button if they wanted to. And so as soon as I saw the internet, I said, "Oh man, this is a place for me to share my takes on whatever." So I sort of started right about the time that it was possible to do so.
Yeah. Let me just share just a little bit about my experience because I find, besides what I alluded to in the introduction, that I have the same fascination slash addiction with what's going on, and also with this really generalist approach that you have as well. In other words, when I say to people, as I did in the introduction, that you write, you contextualize each of these stories, that would not just be foreign news. It would just be tech news. It would not just be public health news. It would be sports. It would be, in other words, you got to be a true generalist to be able to understand enough to say something about, all this wide range of things. But in '96, I think I was kind of making an amicable departure, kind of a gradual one, from the entertainment industry, where I'd been a screenwriter and a music writer and a producer and actor and all of these things, and came upon this notion that what would fit my curiosity and my generalism and my ability to feel at home behind a mic or a camera was to be a talk show host. And within a couple of weeks, I ran into a friend who had a show. I co-hosted, and within a couple of weeks, he got a gig and had to give up the show, and I had a show. It was like 6 weeks from kind of thinking that's what I ought to do to having a radio show. And because I was at KPFK, which is the Pacifica station down here, you have KPFA up there in the Bay Area. Nobody told me what to do. There was not enough staff or enough anything to bother me much. And so from 96 to 2014, I did an hour a week, an hour interview like the one we're having, which meant that I was looking at everything, choosing who I would talk to that week, having that conversation, putting it out, and so on. I put that on hiatus in 2014. I just thought, God, this is too much time I'm putting into this. And then when Trump was elected, I felt, well, it's something I do. I better do it again, and I've been doing it ever since. So I just want you to sort of get a feel for the same do-it-yourself. It's one of the things that I've heard you talk about this and so on, is that one of the things that is true to all of the, that early Next Draft, that early tech one, all of this is that by keeping it Dave Central, it is really what's off the top of your head. It's what's in your heart. It's your thing. And you have never had to deal, if I'm not mistaken, with editors or anybody who's telling you what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I have had Next Draft syndicated over the years at a few different publications. Time syndicated it for a while, Quartz syndicated it for a while. So I have had occasional feedback, but generally no. And it's interesting because when I first started Next Draft, I tried to be exhaustive with the content and think, well, if this is called a newsletter that covers the day's most fascinating news, I really have to be exhaustive. And it had a lot more stories than the current version today. But then my wife gave me the advice that no, you really don't have to be exhaustive. People have other sources of news. What you have to do is focus on what you have a take on. And that was really the turning point when the newsletter started to get popular, was when I made it more a reflection of what interested me. So you called those topics that I cover a wide breadth of content, and it is, but it's really just the stuff I'm interested in and the level to which I'm interested in. Although I'm probably a little bit more into sports and some other topics than I cover in Next Draft. But in general, it's stuff that I'm interested in, stuff that I have something to say about. And the way I like to communicate the most and write the most is sort of counterpunching off other content. So Next Draft really lets me do that. I open up about 50 to 60 browser tabs every morning. I find the stories that are most fascinating and interesting to me. I try to add some context and connect stories that may not be clearly connected to somebody who's speeding through the internet. And then what comes out of that is really almost like what I think of as a modern day column. I think if the column form were invented today, it would look a lot like Next Draft. It would be a series of takes on what's going on around the world or around a community, with links where people could get more information on those topics. And even the style of my newsletter, which is short blurbs, I separate them by numbers, but they're essentially unique blurbs on different topics, is sort of inspired by a Bay Area columnist who was famous for decades, named Herb Caen.
Oh, I lived in the Bay Area 1 year, but certainly remember Herb Caen.
Yeah, so he did three-dot journalism, he called it, where he would just have, a little paragraph on different topics. And that's sort of what I try to do, except my community that I'm covering is not San Francisco, it's the whole internet.
Right, right. I think Winchell was a lot that way as well. This new kind of what we look at when we usually see an op-ed now or an opinion piece now or a column is usually one person's 800-word take on something or so on. But the one you're referring to, the bits and pieces kind of thing, has been around a while. And I think you're right that what you've done is you've taken, and now you can have links, and back then they couldn't. Let me also ask you, what is your process? What is Dave Pell's day like? And I ask that not just because you put out, a 10 subject newsletter every single day. And let me say, do you skip any weekend days? I know you didn't in 2020, but do you?
Yeah, no, I only do it on weekdays.
Okay, so
The only exception to that was during the pandemic's
yeah,
peak where I felt people needed
right.
extra
And
info.
I got used to that, but yeah, so it's daily weekdays. Um, but what is that process? As so partly just because you cover so much and distill so much, and as I said, don't just give me the link, but give me your take. But then also you have this day job of doing investing in startups and so on. How does all of that work on a day-to-day basis for Dave Pell?
Yeah, well, I've been investing in startups for about 30 years, so these days I usually follow younger and smarter people, so it doesn't take up a ton of time really. It takes a long time for an investment to come to fruition, but it doesn't take up that much of my time. My day is split up morning writing, afternoon investing, but my psyche is split up like 98% writing and 2% the other thing, just in terms of what I'm focused on or
Sure.
what I'm thinking about when I'm laying awake at night or whatever. So, I mean, I'm always looking for interesting stories, and I have friends who will send me links they think are interesting, and readers who will do the same. And I'm getting links on Twitter throughout the day. In terms of actual, I would say like sort of sit down in front of the computer work, I usually do about an hour every night to get a few stories and a head start on some stuff that I think might be extra interesting, especially if it's a normal week of news, which we don't have many of these days, but where I can lead with almost anything. So I might find my lead story and think about it a bit the night before.
Mm.
And then the next day I'd say from about 9 to noon, that's when I really lock in and open the tabs and find the stories. When I first started doing Next Draft, I use Safari and I save things to reading lists, which is like a quick
Mm-hmm.
bookmarking tool. When I first started, I'd say I'd probably save about 30 stories and then narrow it down to 10. These days, since I've been doing it so long and it's so instinctual, I probably save about 12 stories
Mm.
to get to my 10. So I sort of know, based on what I've been writing about and thinking about in the days before, and based on what I'm seeing on the internet that day, what's interesting to me, what's a standout feature story that people can get a break with, and then what's this sort of ongoing series of storylines that are sort of defining our politics and our culture at that moment, and sort of keep those stories going. If I think they're key through lines that we should cover.
Mm-hmm. So there's the daily one-off that happened and caught your attention and penetrated your consciousness in a way, and then there's the sort of ongoing thematic stories that there'll be chapters, if you will, every day or so.
Right, yeah. And it's usually like I say, in a normal news cycle, I try to make the first story where I these days write a little bit more about be something a little bit unique and not necessarily what you'd find leading every other newspaper. It's really about personal interest or something I find most fascinating as opposed to the top story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, During a time like this when we have Putin invading
Yeah.
Ukraine, then that's so clearly top of mind. And one thing that happens that I don't think people realize, especially because they complain to me about covering the same story over and over, is that when these big stories happen, a ton of the media energy and focus is on those stories. So it's much harder to find stories that don't fit
Mm-hmm.
that media, I call it media momentum, that don't fit into that. So I had a lot of that during, Next Draft really didn't start out being particularly political. Before Next Draft, I wrote a political blog and I covered the political conventions, and I just got tired of being one of many voices on either side of the aisle just
Mm-hmm.
yelling at each other, or yelling into the void, really. So I switched to all news. In during the Trump era, that became impossible to not be political because everything was political, and by 2020, that included the air that we breathed. So it became much more political and much more focused on these big key stories: Trump, uh, Black Lives Matter, the upcoming election,
The
COVID.
pandemic.
Right, and the pandemic, of course, is the biggie, which sort of ran across all of those in one way or another. And I would get emails from people who said, I've been reading you for years, and you used to not be this political, and you're
Hmm.
only covering Trump every day. And I would email the people back and say, you find me the stories that are not focused on one of these three or four topics. They're just not out there. Almost every great journalist, at least writing daily journalism during the Trump era, was on Trump. People who had been covering the Secret Service were now covering Trump. People who had been covering finance were now covering Trump's finance. So it was harder to find different stories. And it was unpleasant for me. It wasn't my goal to turn my newsletter into this sort of unitopic that some of the cable networks had turned into. But it was very hard to find other compelling topics to cover, really.
I totally understand. I will say one interesting note I recall in my early days of doing my interviews, I attempted to sort of cover widely or something. I don't even know what my original one. And there was one day when I realized when I'm really interested, it sounds more interesting. And it was that same sort of shift you made, that it's like, yeah, if you're gonna do this intense work, people are gonna, I think, respond to what plays with your passion, your curiosity the most. That, in a way, is really the subjects change, but that's really what's the core of it, what's the driving force of it, and that's clearly true for you.
Yeah, that's definitely the goal. I mean, some people accuse me of being biased, and I'm like, my head is the logo. It's like, of course I'm biased. This is my take on the day. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's what I like doing, and luckily the internet came around at a good time for me, so that I could sort of create tools that help me represent what I was good at doing, as opposed to having to adapt my limited skills to an existing platform.
hmm I've heard you talk about that. So talk about that just a little more, because I think to some people who might be blogging or might be podcasting, your solution to how to make the most of what you loved to do really did have to do with these internet tools. Can you talk just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, really, like I said, in terms of writing, what I really like to do is almost mirror the type of conversations I used to have with my dad about the news. We'd be sitting there watching Bernard Shaw on CNN, and the news would come up, and then we'd both share our takes. Back then, mostly his, and maybe mine was more comic relief. But
Mm-hmm.
then that's the kind of conversational way I like to present content, where I'm having a conversation, in this case with news, basically, and I'm ingesting material, uh, sort of contextualizing it, describing it in a clear way, and seeing connections that maybe the average person who's not in there all day, every day in the muck wouldn't necessarily see. So that's sort of the way I think and like to write and like to communicate as it is. So when the internet came around, I basically was able to take those tools, whether it be linking or creating short blurbs or having a newsletter and a blog. And today I have a newsletter, a blog, and an app. I'm on Apple News. I'm on Substack. Basically, anywhere a person is or likes to read something, I am. And that all comes from just one block of text that I paste into a big form, custom WordPress install that an engineer built for me. So I write it the same way I wrote it in the earliest days of the internet, with HTML that would not work appropriately in today's web, but he just fixes it all algorithmically and then pushes it to all those different sources. So it really let me basically next draft as a true representation of what I want to share and how I think and how my mind works, as opposed to, like I just wrote a book, so I'm limited by the form of the book. I'm limited by the timing of how long a book takes to get published, and I'm I benefit and am limited from, that it's a group activity. When you write a book, you have a publisher, you have an editor, you have a lot of marketing people involved. Whereas with internet stuff, you can sort of hone it and just say, this is the exact tool I need to express myself the most clearly. So we do rightfully discuss so many negatives about the internet, especially the social media aspect of the internet, which of course came up in 2020 and is perplexing us right up to this day. But I do like to remind people there's always a flip side to these
Mm-hmm.
debates, and
Mm-hmm.
there are incredible things about the internet. Even in 2020, on one hand, we were seeing fake news spread so much faster on Facebook because of their algorithms that it was threatening our very democracy. On the other hand, my at the time 11 and 12-year-old daughter was at her peak point of social development where she should be hanging around with her friends and criticizing her parents, stuck in her bedroom on Zoom all day long. So, in that case, things like FaceTime and social media and TikTok and Snapchat really rescued her um, ability to have some kind of social development and social life during a bleak period. So there's always two sides to these things, and like many issues, if you take a step back and take a breath, you realize there's two parts of it, and being really careful about a negative aspect of something doesn't mean that you are denying the positive aspect of it. And I think, especially when it comes to technology, people who are sort of true believers in tech, and like I said, I've been investing in internet companies for my whole adult life. So I am a believer in technology,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also a believer in criticizing it and pointing out the dangers associated with it. And we really see people that are the true believers snap back on that and get angry about that. We're seeing a lot of that with what's being called Web 3.0 and the blockchain and Bitcoin. I see a lot of risks in that stuff. And yet, if you bring up those risks, you're considered a naysayer and you're sort of
Mm-hmm.
shouted down
Mm-hmm.
by the true believers, even though we completely screwed up in Web 1.0 and 2.0, ending up building the exact opposite of what we thought we were building. And yet, you're sort of yelled down if you say, hey, should we step back and make sure Web 3 has a better outcome? And I just think that that's a way that people have a hard time looking at the world, that there's positives and negatives to things, and pointing out a negative means you want to improve the
That's
positive. It
right.
doesn't mean you're saying technology is terrible. um,
Yeah, well, writ large, Dave, that's the people who say you ask for more social justice, you ask for more economic justice. People say you hate America. I mean, that's the writ large version of what you're talking about with the internet.
Right. I mean, the whole, when you really look at news, a lot of people complain there's not enough positive news stories. And I would agree with that. And every Friday I do this thing called Feel Good Friday where I link to positive stories. And people always say, oh, why don't you do this every day? We need more of this. And it's a little hard to find positive stories in the media. And I get that from a sort of mood stabilizing standpoint and a broader overview of what's happening in our world and our neighborhoods and our communities. On the other hand, one of the purposes of news is to be a watchdog for what's going on in the world. And that usually comes out by them saying, here's something negative that's happening. And hopefully something being done about that. That doesn't mean that the journalists hate society or hates America. It just means they're finding a story that they're acting as a watchdog for something going wrong and then leaving it up to, either politicians or grassroots movements to do something about it. But yeah, it doesn't mean it's negative. I mean, I really think this is really coming to play and will be in the next coming months and years when it comes to Web 3.0,
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, people have been praising the idea of decentralization of the web and decentralization of money and Bitcoin and Ethereum. But this week, we're seeing how Western democracies have been able to use centralized banking and centralized financial systems to punish Putin for invading Ukraine. If his whole fortune was based on a Bitcoin blockchain um, type situation, uh, who would be able to lock it down? How would governments be able to use that power in order to corral evildoer or somebody who gets out of line. And there may be an answer to that, but I don't know the answer.
Hmm.
And it's worth asking those questions as we move forward into this new world. The problem is that the people who are most enthusiastic about it don't want to hear that kind of commentary.
Sounds right to me. Let me tell people this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking today with Dave Pell. He's writer of the popular daily newsletter The Next Draft, and he's recently released his first book, Please Scream Inside Your Heart: Breaking News and Nervous Breakdowns in the Year That Wouldn't End. It's his take in almost a chronological fashion on the year 2020. And you can learn more at nextdraft.com or please scream one-word.com. I think that the notion, just one thing I wanted to reflect on what you were saying, is the notion, yes, that if you are looking for a solution, you've got to lay out the problem. And sort of the more you face the facts, the more you acknowledge the problem, I think the better chance you have of solving it. And you can't worry about, or you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You got to do both. Promoting the podcast, I do kind of a newsletter once a week, and I use 10 articles, and I find usually 4 positive, 6 negative, kind of. That's sort of what the range is. Because with the same, why my show, why I say it's a world that just might work rather than a world that works or a world that's screwed, is that that's sort of the attitude, is that if we do the right things, we have a chance of making this work. Let me ask you a couple of things about how does a newsletter like yours gain popularity, and both how big and who is your audience these days?
I wish I had a better answer to the first one because I'm really horrible at marketing. In my case, it just got big because I've been doing it so long. So it sort of spread word of mouth. In the early days, there were, other blogs linking to it or news articles linking to it. Maybe there was a few more of that when the rise of the newsletters, the latest iteration of that, which is about the 12th since I've been writing newsletters, has come about. But it's hard to get press and get really notice for something that's been around for a while. It's a lot easier when you're doing something new. So it's really been mostly people sharing it, word of mouth, people
Which is,
liking it.
as I said, how I found.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and that's obviously the best way for things to spread, but it's can be slower than the spreader wants it to be. That's one of the things about the dopamine that the internet drips out. It's never really enough. So I have about 130,000 subscribers now, which just seems horrible to me, but probably seems great to somebody starting a newsletter today.
To me, it does seem like something that when you sit down to write, I've heard you say you don't write for 130,000. You sort of are writing for yourself and a few people and so on. But to know that this take is going to be seen by 130,000 people, that I'm sitting here in my office or my room, just putting my take on things. I mean, it's not millions, it's not, TikTok numbers, but it's still potent. And as I said, I read it, basically every day, start to finish. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. And that's a testament to how good it is and how consistent it is. But I'm just saying also, it seems to me to know that there's, over 100,000 people that are going to get this take is better than just blowing off steam.
Yeah, no, it's definitely cool. Don't get me wrong, and I appreciate your readership and anybody who takes the time to read it, because I thrive on those reads. That's just how maybe it works in every industry, but that's just how the internet makes
Yeah.
you feel. If you get 1,000 retweets, then you're like, why didn't I get 2,000?
I do agree,
But
yes.
occasionally I am sitting like at a Warrior game or something like that, and I'll say to my son, "Oh, look at if you take all the people in this stadium, like double that is how many read my newsletter this morning." And he just tells me to shut up. But for me, it feels good for a couple of minutes right there.
Yes. You have described, I think you even think of it as a conversation with your readers, an ongoing dialogue, that sort of thing. Have you done comments what was your experience with comments if you tried them, etc.? That whole thing. How do you feel that you are able to keep that feeling of an ongoing conversation alive?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think of it more as a monologue than a dialogue, definitely, to be totally honest
Sure.
about it. And I have done social aspects like comments in the past. I've just never found it to be that useful of content, not only for next draft, but just even as a consumer of other people's sites, especially these days, where people are just yelling at each other. But in general, I just haven't found that much value, and you really need a ton of readers. If you're the New York Times and you have a few million people reading an article, and then out of that you have, a few thousand commenting, then it gets a real good conversation going. If you're in at my level, it's usually going to be, 10 to 100 regular commenters who people just get tired of hearing from. But I just don't find that content interesting. Of course, with newsletters, what people don't always realize, I'm always surprised that they're surprised, is that it is a two-way experience. I mean, if somebody wants to respond to me, all they have to do is hit reply. And a lot of people do that. Interestingly, the first time people do that, they always say, I'm not sure if anyone on your team is going
Right.
to get this or not. But I'm like, well, there is no one on my team except for me. And like, why wouldn't I get it? Who else would it go to? So I do have those kind of conversations with people giving, takes on subjects or finding typos, which is the internet's favorite sport, or, giving positive reinforcement also, which is something that doesn't get noticed much on the internet, but it actually does happen quite often. People tend to root for the personal brands or the people that they follow on the internet. I remember I was back in, I think it was 2004, was the John Kerry
Mm-hmm.
Democratic National Convention in Cambridge, in Boston, and that was the first year they ever gave bloggers press passes. So it shows you how it was a totally different era, right? And so I was one of about 30 bloggers to get a press pass to that event, and we were sort of the story because conventions are so horribly rote and boring that anything out of the ordinary becomes the story. So we were followed around by NPR and CNN and doing live shots because that was the big story, that the bloggers were there. But what was interesting about it is I got much more feedback from my readers then of my political blog back then that I was included among the people getting it and that I would be going to that event than I ever did about the political commentary I made. So it's really that sort of personal connection that you can make with people that is the most powerful aspect. I mean, I have people that I've been reading for years and I just feel like I know them.
Mm-hmm.
So if something happened to them or if they have a loss in their family or whatever, I feel that that stuff is actually important as a mode of communication, especially as we become more online creatures. So I make sure that if I'm going to be out for a week because my kids have a break, like I did last week,
Mm-hmm.
that I mention that's why. I'm not, I don't want to have somebody else ghostwriting it for me for the week. I want it to be more human, and more real. So if I'm bummed, I'll say I'm bummed, and if I'm happy or whatever, and I don't want to share too much, obviously, but it's about my personal or my kids or whatever. But everybody that reads Next Draft regularly, they know I have a couple
Mm-hmm.
beagles. They know I have a couple kids who give me a hard time 24/7. So I feel like that's one of the powers, especially of newsletters, because you're in an inbox along with messages from people's mothers and their
Mm-hmm.
friends. And I feel you have to earn that spot with more than just an article. So that's what I try to do, is try to bring my personal um, life into it just enough to do that. And
Yeah.
also that's just because that is what I'm thinking about also.
Uh-huh. No, if you hadn't brought that up, I was going to. That we will hear about your wife, your children, your pets, your, some weather that might be happening to you, things like that, so that it's a human being, not just a bunch of takes.
Right. And the beautiful part about having two teenage kids is there's zero chance they'll ever read anything I write about them. So I can pretty much say whatever I want and be safe.
No, it's funny. I was going to ask you about that too. Your humor is self-deprecating. But then I realized you don't just deprecate yourself; you deprecate your kids too. But what you're saying is the reason you're free to do that is that they're never going to read it.
Yeah, if it's really bad, I'll read it to them because
Yeah,
I want to gain
clear
the
it.
upper
Yeah,
hand.
yeah.
But no, not clear it. I just want to make sure they hear it. But
Okay.
otherwise, no, there's really no chance. Just as there's no chance any of them will crack open my book or anything. So my son said, "Oh, your first page is one of the best first pages ever written," but it really falls off after that. So I said, "What'd you get to about page three?" So
Yeah.
anyway,
So let's talk about
teens.
let's yeah, exactly. Let's talk about the book. Why a book? And then why this book and why now?
Well, there's two answers to why the book and why this book. I've always wanted to write a book, actually, since I was a kid. And for years, I would always think of an idea. That's what when I can't sleep late at night after everybody's in bed, that's what I do is think, what could I write a book about? And I'm not really, I don't have a fiction mind. Everything I write, including Next Draft, really ultimately ends up being about me. I sort of have more of the non-malignant narcissistic personality. And so I've always wanted to write a book. I knew it would be something nonfiction. And every now and then I would go to my wife and say, how about this? And she'd be like, I don't think you're the right person for that. I don't know if people would want to read that. But one night about, I'd say maybe April or May of the 2020 during the when the pandemic really got real and the quarantine was really getting serious, at about 2 in the morning, I thought, oh, this is like the story of our lives, and this is an experience like no other. And it's not just the pandemic, but it's this political battle about the future direction of America. It's about the divide in America and this sort of universal experience that we're all having with the quarantine and pandemic and all the struggles. And so I thought, well, it's a big story and it's sort of overwhelming. And on a day to day basis, it's impossible to keep up with. And it would be even harder to sort of contextualize or add context to the chaos, really. But then I thought, this is what I've basically been doing for the last 10 years. So I've sort of been training for this moment my whole
Mm-hmm.
life. So I went upstairs and woke up my wife and I said, how about this? How about like a next draft-esque look at 2020 with a lot of takes about how we got here and our relationship to the media? And she said, yeah, that's it. Start writing. So
Wow.
basically I started writing. So that's the sort of me thinking I'm the guy to do this and this moment is sort of made for my skills. And also because I try to add a lot of humor into my news, and especially during 2020 when it was getting really harsh, the news, and everybody was pretty bummed. I think that humor added a little bit of medicine. I mean, sugar to make the
Yeah,
medicine go
yeah.
down. So I wanted to also do that in my book, and there's a lot of people who can probably write better about authoritarianism and the inner game of politics than I can. But I can sort of tell that story in a way that is slightly enjoyable. Or, my book's title comes from a roller coaster meme that happened during 2020, and I try to make the book like a roller coaster so that there is fun and enjoyable, and it's a fast read. But in there, you get these doses that I think are important for people to take away. So that was the why me, the why and why this book. Why I really felt it was important was because of mostly my relationship with my dad and what he had been saying to me throughout the Trump's running for the election that he won and lead up to the election that he lost, and throughout that whole period. My dad, as you mentioned in the intro, was a Holocaust survivor. He was one of only um, a few people from his town to survive, and only person from his family. He lived in the Polish forest during winter for 4 or 5 months alone. He was only able to join a partisan group after he got a gun and ammunition.
And he was a teenager at the time.
Yeah, he was a teenager at the time. He's the least liberal, snowflakey, hysterical personality of anybody I've ever known. He understood world events deeply. He would understand this Putin Ukraine thing perfectly because he, grew up in that part of the world and has seen this before and knows what this attack and on democracy and scapegoating of people and dividing them looks like firsthand. And when Trump was first running, he started complaining, a lot of this guy's speeches are reminding me of Hitler's early speeches, and everybody always laughed at Hitler and said he was a big joke too. And I was pretty worried then, but as it got into the later years of Trump's term, and my dad kept getting more and more worried about what he was seeing, and saying, why aren't more Americans out in the streets protesting? Don't they see that their democracy is being taken away? And he didn't live to see the January 6th insurrection, but he predicted Trump will never leave. Don't worry about what the polls say. It's meaningless. People like this don't leave. He'll never admit defeat. That long after this race is done, it'll still be going on. He's never going to admit any of this. He's going to continue to attack democracy. And one day he was right before the quarantine, he was sort of lamenting these issues about people not being out in the streets and Americans not taking this seriously enough because so few of us had seen it. And he wasn't arguing, that there was going to be a Holocaust here. He was just arguing that our democratic institutions weren't holding up to the attacks they were under. And, I said, I think people in America and my generation, they see the danger, but they just don't think what happened to you could ever happen here. And he sort of paused. I remember it was a rainy day, and he said, you think when I was a kid, I ever thought it could happen there? And as soon as he said that, I realized this is a message I have to channel. So that was sort of the important part about why I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to write the book and get the message out, because my dad was probably greater than me in every possible way you can imagine. He was a hero. He was a ridiculously successful businessman. But the one thing that I probably could do a little bit better than he could was this: talking to you about something, writing a book, communicating through writing. So I thought if I can take his message from this non-hysterical, probably Republican for most of his life, nobody could possibly call him a snowflake, maybe the toughest guy I've ever known, is saying, hey, you better be worried about what's happening here and take it seriously, then that's a message that I wanted to get across to a broader population of people through a book. And I wanted to do it with my brand. So you might laugh for 3 pages
Mm-hmm.
and you might be entertained for 3 pages, but then on that seventh page, you're going to hear a quote or two, not from me, but from my dad. And when somebody who's seen it and experienced it says it, people really tend to listen. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing attacks on democracy from Ukraine to Mar-a-Lago these days, at the very moment when we're losing the last of those World War
Mm.
II survivors who have seen these rising of fascism and diminishment of democracy with their own eyes and know exactly what it looks like. And we're telling us, what you're seeing is exactly what's happening.
Yeah. In your book, you contrast, you say, and I'm going to quote you, so much of Trumpism was summed up by Trump's comment, just remember what you were seeing and what you were reading is not what's happening, and that your dad's message is the opposite. It is exactly what is happening.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to, in fairness to people's perceptions, it is hard to accept the last few years
Mm-hmm.
that what we're seeing is really happening. It's hard to think about, your kids missing school, your elderly parents, you can't go visit them and they're locked up in basically a virtual jail during their golden years. Political fighting, democracy being challenged, economic challenges, more hate, the truth about racial issues coming to the surface. This stuff isn't all fun to think about.
Yeah. And
But
climate change. Throw that in.
yeah, and climate change, yeah. I mean, I worry our kids have a lot of stuff to deal with instead of just being kids. But not thinking about it is exactly what people who want to have minority rule and who want to divide us want. So my brand is basically, I want people to think about it and understand it, but in the least horrific way that I can present it.
Right. Yes, you're tapping them on the shoulder. You're reminding them this is what's happening, but in a way that is not overwhelming. Does that seem?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, yeah, not overwhelming and sort of not academic and not
Hmm.
only that, you know. I mean, if the
That's all.
internet has taught us anything about the way people consume content is, you know, they see a speech by Zelensky from the Ukraine in one tweet, they see Steph Curry hitting
Yeah.
23s in the next tweet, and they see a hilarious meme in the next tweet. So this is what we see. This is how we absorb content. So you know, I think narrowing it and trying to give people 1,000 tweets on the battle for democracy, you're probably going to lose them after you get with you still have 997 to go. So if you can, you know, for better or worse, fit your content into the way that people are sort of used to absorbing content, I think it's can be a little bit more effective. And either way, that's also just my brand. That's how I
Hmm.
deliver it.
Hmm.
I don't have 300 pages on the history of fascism in Europe, but I have like three incredible pages wrapped up with a lot of other information.
Hmm. You know, I thought it was interesting when you said you'd always wanted to write a book, and someone who was as disciplined as you to put this thing out every day, and as prolific as you, never felt the time was right till now, or the subject was right, or you were right. I find that very interesting. And then, as you say, at this moment, so many things came together, and I want readers, listeners, to know that your parents, especially your father, is very much a presence in this book, more than he is in the next draft, but definitely a presence in the book. There's something deeply felt about that throughout the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of my friends who was kind enough to blurb the book, Dahlia Lithwick, who
Yeah,
writes for Slate and is an MSNBC contributor and an all around smart and great person,
yeah.
sort of wrote that in her blurb, she put what the book was about, and then she said it's also a love letter to his father and, you know, the millions of people who have fought, know that democracy is something you have to fight for. And she put it better than, you know, it occurred to me for the first time really at that point that it is just as much that, you know, if I could have written a book just about my relationship to media and how it emerged and how our country relationship to media has followed a similar path, and how to think about that and how my relationship with my parents drove that and what that means in my life, then that would have been the whole book, you know. And that's definitely the most important book, a part of the book to me. No matter what, I have been trying to decide what book I would write for about 30 years, but
Mm-hmm.
that part, uh, my parents and our relationship to the media, that part has been written, you know, in my mind for all those 30 years. That was definitely going in. It was just a matter of what was going to be the sort of delivery mechanism for that message.
Very good. If I gave you a couple of minutes, just sort of to say, okay, next draft comes out every weekday. The book is available. This is what I want you. This is what I hope you get. This is what I hope you see moving forward. What would that be?
The first would be the stuff we've been talking about for the last few minutes about awareness of what you're seeing is what's really happening. The second would be to have people have a better awareness of their relationship with the media.
Mm.
As I say in the book, you know, the first goal of any media organization is to convince you of the inherent value of news. And I do think I've dedicated my life to, you know, reading the news or being like news consumer number one. I'm not really a journalist, but I'm sort of the chief news consumer. So I think it's important, obviously, also, but it's not something that you need to get news notifications about. It's not something you need to track 24 hours a day. Even when there's a huge story like Putin invading Ukraine, you can read about it once a day, like we used to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we defeated fascism once with a newspaper landing on our stoop once a day. We could do it again. The idea that you have to be aware of it every second of every day is just a result of news organizations sort of gamifying and algorithmically sending you news much in the same way Facebook and Twitter want to keep you on there.
Right.
So for
Tapping your
people to,
dopamine, basically.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, so for people to have a healthier relationship with that would be the second one. And the third one would really be that ultimately, until we address our division, and when I mean division, I mean it across the board, our economic division, our geographic division, our internet division. It's going to be really hard to address all of these issues because, right now we're just all screaming into these voids, but they're not even the same void.
Mm-hmm.
We have almost no overlap, and it goes down all the way to the neighborhood level. We're really becoming red and blue, and rich and not rich across tiny geographic regions, and there's almost no interaction, and somehow that's spread online and elsewhere. And I always think as people, feel hate, speaking of dopamine, which hate is probably the strongest form of dopamine, um, to think who is it benefiting when I feel this hate for somebody else? And could it be possible that I hate this sort of manufactured other as much as I think I do? Because I always tell people I've never hated anybody in real life
Mm.
as I hate the caricature of the average Trump voter.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
there must be something to that. It's when I actually interact with people who have different political views than I do, I don't feel hate for them, and I feel we have more in common than we have that separates us. And we're usually talking about those things like our families and sports and our aches and pains and normal human things that connect us, as opposed to politics, which has come to sort of dominate our lives. So really, I think that's the key takeaway, that I don't have a solution to how we're going to do that, but I would look at how divided we are and how the vacuums left by our lack of community can be filled in by people whose benefit from us disliking each other.
So again, the weekday newsletter is Next Draft, and the book is Please Scream Inside Your Heart. You can learn more at nextdraft.com or pleasescream.com. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TERRENCEMCNALLY.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com, all one word. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 10 articles to flesh out the conversation, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on Apple Podcasts and most major podcast sites. You'll find years of podcasts at my site or at those sites. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Greg Boyle, George Packer, Connie Rice. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Dave Pell, and keep up your good work.
Thanks a lot for having me on. It was great. Appreciate it.
Okay. And folks, nextdraft.com. Try it. You'll like it. Thanks a lot.